Welcome, everyone, to the book launch for Geoff Mann's In the Long Run, We're All Dead, Keynesianism, Political Economy, and Revolution, published by Verso this year in 2017. My name is Am Johal. I'm director of SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Delighted to be partnering with SFU's Geography Department as part of this book launch. I wanted to begin by recognizing that we're on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We're delighted to be hosting Geoff tonight. He's given a couple of talks here, including inviting his class a number of times here. For those of you who are coming here for the first time, we do about 100 public events a year here, and the information is up on sfuwoodwards.ca, from film screenings to public talks. We'll be screening Angry Anuk here in a couple of weeks, a free screening with the National Film Board later this month. We do have an event sheet that's available in the back of the room. Also wanted to thank Pulp Fiction Books for being on site to sell Geoff's book. It's available in the back, and Pulp Fiction and Chris Brayshaw, who one of our great independent bookstores we have left here in Vancouver. So for many of you in the room, I can see know Geoff and have known him for years. For those of you who don't know him, Geoff lives in Vancouver, where he teaches political economy and economic geography at SFU. He directs the Center for Global Political Economy. He's the author of The General Theory of Employment, Interest in Money, and Reader's Companion from Verso 2017. Disassembly Required, a field guide to actually existing capitalism with AK Press in 2013. And Our Daily Bread, Wages, Workers, and the Political Economy of the American West with UNC in 2007, which won the American Sociological Association's Paul Sweezy Prize and the American Political Science Association's Michael S. Harrington Award. Climate Leviathan, a political theory of our planetary future, co-authored with Joel Wainwright, will appear with Verso in January 2018. Also, outside of his work at SFU, with the BC chapter of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, I see Seth Klein right here. Geoff is the chair of the Research Advisory Committee. So please join me in welcoming Geoff Mann.
I'm nervous, so I'm going to talk from back here. Thanks a lot, Am. Sorry, I have a loud voice and I'm going to yell. Thank you all for... Jean, you were right. The person who's running all the tech told me that if I'm not blinded, I can't be seen. And I'm definitely blinded right now. But I'd like to thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And I'd like to thank Am and Sama and Grace and all the folks here for making this event possible. Also Chris and JP at Pulp Fiction, who have been big supporters of mine for years now. And I really appreciate that. I think probably more people have read my books because of them than almost anyone else. So I really appreciate that. Also, my family and friends are here, students, some of whom are pretty darn close to friends. I feel really lucky to have you all here, so I appreciate this. My wife, Michelle, and I had planned one of these for the last book, which was the Disassembly Required. And instead of this kind of thing, we rented a bar, and I spoke for 5 minutes, 4 of which I cried, and thanking everyone. So I'm going to try and avoid that tonight. My plan for this evening is to speak for about half an hour about the book, so you have a feel for what it's about and the concerns that motivated me to write it. Hopefully that's compelling. And then we'll have a chance to have some more beers and all of that kind of thing that was really the main hope of this event, is to celebrate the fact that my family doesn't have to deal with this book anymore. Even though hopefully it was worth the trouble. So thanks a lot for coming. I was recently away and I gave a couple talks about the book, and one of them titled the talk without asking me, Faith for the Faithless, which is a term that I used when I was writing some of the copy for the cover, because they constantly pressure you to write this material for the cover of the book. But I actually think it captures something of what I want to speak about, which is the role that what I describe as Keynesianism has come to play in a modern, anxious sensibility about the trajectory of modern capitalism and where we're headed. And so much of what I want to talk about tonight is a reflection on an anxiety and a sort of sense of tragedy, I would even say, that suffuses the consciousness of many as we face a future that seems increasingly uncertain, and not only uncertain, but perhaps even destined to fail, and how we kind of come to grips with that, both politically, but also from a political economic perspective. So I'm just going to flick through these slides and tell you a little bit about the book. So the origins of the book were, unsurprisingly, for many of you in the room, they lay in the moment immediately following the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, when all of a sudden, and many of you will remember this, Keynes, the economist, was back from the dead. He had resurrected himself, or been resurrected following the collapse of Lehman Brothers in the fall of 2008. And not only him, but his work, particularly the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which was published in 1936, so it's quite an old book, were back on the pages of economics journals and economic policy and in newspapers and magazines and virtually everywhere. Now, of course, Keynes had been, as many of you know, the economist savior, to some extent, of the post-war boom era, from 1945, let's say, to the late 60s, early 70s. But then, as many of you will probably know, so this, and I say this because this is a cover of Time magazine from 1965. And Keynes, who died in 1946, is on the cover of Time 20 years later as the savior of the moment. But by the late 60s and early 70s, Keynes ran into some trouble. Keynes and Keynesianism, the thinking that came from his economic theorizing, or is related to his economic theorizing. First, stagflation in the 1970s seemed to prove many of his economic theories wrong. And then the sort of surge of monetarist and new classical economics in the early 80s and late 70s effectively killed him off, at least in terms of economic policy, despite the efforts of many people and economists, post-Keynesians, new Keynesians, any variety of Keynesians you want to talk about, trying to resurrect him. For the most part, he was seen as a character in a period piece, or, you know, a symbol of the nostalgia for the post-war era and the world that my parents grew up in. And his depression economics, which was the nickname that was given to it, in other words, economics that was only useful during a depression, was deemed irrelevant. And in fact, it was deemed so irrelevant that Robert Lucas, who I would argue is the most important anti-Keynesian that the world has seen, even more important than Milton Friedman himself, in his presidential address to the American Economic Association in 2003, so 5 years before calamity, said this, and I've blocked out the part that I want you to pay attention to. This is a text of the speech itself. My thesis in this lecture is that macroeconomics, Keynes was a macroeconomist, macroeconomics in this original sense has succeeded. Its central problem of depression prevention has been solved for all practical purposes and has in fact been solved for many decades, in other words, since the 70s. There remain important gains in welfare from better fiscal policies, but I argue that these are gains from providing people with better incentives to work and to save, not from better fine-tuning of spending flows. In other words, Keynes was not only wrong, but the problems that he thought what he had helped with were no longer even worth talking about. Now, 5 years later, as you know, this is the fall of January 2003, 5 years later, all hell breaks loose. The supposedly impossible happens, and instead of Lucas, we now have a string of celebrations of Keynes' forgotten wisdom. So this is only the most famous of them, and perhaps the best written of them. It's Robert Skidelsky's book, The Return of the Master, and the master is Keynes himself. But one of the interesting things about this celebration and the return of Keynes was the fact that I'm having a lot of trouble getting used to the fact that I can't see any of you. I'm speaking into this ether. I'm hoping you're out there. It would be really bad if they raised the lights and the room was empty. Where was I? Oh, yes. And so it wasn't just, thank you very much. So it wasn't just Keynesians who were doing this celebrating. A wide swath of people from all sorts of walks of life and political commitments were celebrating the return of Keynes. Richard Posner, sort of often considered an arch-conservative jurist in the United States. The liberal Financial Times is celebrating Keynes. The lefties in The Nation are celebrating Keynes. And so we start to see these crazy celebrations. This is from Time magazine. The comeback, that people are always trying to come up with a good gimmick. The comeback Keynes, once derided, his ideas now dominate DC's crisis toolkit. This is from the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal. The new old big thing in economics. This is, this is sort of standard fare on the bookshelves of, say, Indigo, or, the Keynes solution, the path to global economic prosperity. And I wish that I had a better image of this, but in fact, the book itself has a bright green cover to communicate to you not only that Keynes can save us, but he can make us green too. So it's all set, don't worry. So there's this massive return of Keynes. And in economics proper, we start to see the return of a sort of serious engagement with Keynes's ideas. Here's two very prominent post-Keynesian economists writing The Fall and Rise of Keynesian Economics. And everywhere, markets' glaring inability to self-correct is being criticized and jumped upon by policymakers and thinkers of all sorts and activists. And the state is being forced, sometimes unwillingly, to retake the managerial reins, just as was supposedly the norm during the Keynesian era. Keynes was definitely back among the living. Or, and this is one of my favorite slides that I've ever had, according to, this is from the cover of a libertarian screed called the Freeman. So Keynes is back among the living, or he's back. I love that. So I personally, for what it's worth, have long had an interest in Keynes and Keynesian thinking. It's been a big part of a lot of the stuff that I've tried to write about and think about over the years. But most of that writing and thinking was oriented historically. Because for a variety of reasons, and one of them was the fact that my economic training told me that he was dead. So it all had to be historical. Despite the efforts, as I said, of many to bring him back and to bring his thought back. But then all of a sudden, he's back. And it seemed a real opportunity to think about, the impact of this book that had meant a lot to me, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which many of you might have read, but there's a strong chance that some of you haven't actually read the book. It's a slog, but nonetheless, it seemed like an opportunity to revisit the general theory and to think hard about these categories that he had put forward for us to think about how to confront the financial crisis and the crisis of capitalism more generally. And I was thinking at the time of these ideas of employment, interest, and money, and he tore them apart and thought really hard about how, in his time, the conventional thinking had framed them, and he posited new ways of grasping these concepts. So I actually, originally, in 2008, that's when I started this book, 2008. That's a long time ago. I proposed to Verso that I would kind of, sounds arrogant, I know, but I said I was going to do this, kind of rethink the general theory for our moment. And that's actually what they contracted, and I thought that I was going to write that book. But what emerged in relatively short order was something very different, and for a couple of reasons in particular. First, as many of you will know, because I know many of you in the room were following all of this quite closely, you'll remember that Keynes himself and Keynesianism as a sort of mode of thinking disappeared from public view quite quickly. By the early 2010, the importance of Keynes on the cover of all these magazines had really diminished a great deal. But even more important, actually, from my perspective as an author, what I found interesting is that I dug into Keynesian economics and Keynesian thinking, Keynesian policy recommendations for so many years, and I was reading right through from the 30s up until today. I found, and I have long considered myself a person of the left, much, much, much farther left than anything I would ever associate with Keynes. I couldn't help but discover the Keynesian in myself as I read a lot of this stuff. It was almost like I was reluctantly discovering some part of myself that I hadn't wanted to look at when I was reading this stuff. And that, what I came to call a kind of knee-jerk or anxiety-induced Keynesianism, became the object of the book. To think about the way that how I understood what Keynes was saying was becoming a sort of dominant mode through which not just liberals or even mildly progressive folks, but the left too were coming to understand the world. Keynes seemed to capture something about our time and our ideas about it that provided a lens to think about ourselves, or at least myself, and the mode of thinking in which I'd been trained and was dominant at the time, I would say. It seemed to me that Keynesianism captured something essential about my position, at least, of feeling uncomfortable or even opposed to liberal capitalism, but nonetheless constantly trying to accommodate myself to it, to live in it, despite my own, at least stated, opposition. And so I started to say things in class and with colleagues, things like, Keynes is our Hegel, which sounds super arrogant, but it worked at the time. And I was thinking, of course, of the kinds of relationships that Marx had with Hegel, which was to read, at his time, an incredibly important thinker who seemed to capture for Marx the truth of an upside-down world, a world that Marx would desperately wished would be otherwise, but nonetheless, Hegel captured the truth of it, even if it needed to be otherwise. And it seemed to me that Keynes offered the same opportunity. And so that's kind of what I set out to do once I got my feet underneath me and thought about what the book would really be about, which was to attack these complex of ideas that get called Keynesianism, to be honest, again, it's really arrogant, as Marx might have done, which is to say, not worrying at all about whether or not it was Marxist, but to actually just bring that kind of energetic, honest engagement that I at least associate with Marx's readings of Hegel. And so to do that, that's Hegel on the left. He wasn't the prettiest dude, but maybe no one was back then, I don't know. And the guy on the right is Marx, for those of you who aren't familiar, but almost everyone here will know who that is. At any rate, so my inspiration, my goal here was to engage Keynes in this manner. So I thought, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take Marx's notes on Hegel, which are mostly written from the 1840s, and many of you who have read them will know that they're almost written in this kind of anxiety-induced fervor. Like he'll quote long passages of Hegel, which he had to do by hand, of course. No cutting and pasting in Marx's age. And so he's writing them out, madman, like word for word, long pages, and then he'll spend long paragraphs, and then he'll spend 10 pages just tearing them apart, saying everything's wrong and everything's right and all the rest of it, and then he'll just move on to the next page. This is these notes that from 1843 in particular that you may be familiar with. And I thought, if I can read Hegel with Marx by my side, then I'll get that kind of juice going. And then I'll go to Keynes and I'll do the same thing. But what was interesting is that for many of you who will be maybe somewhat familiar with Hegel, and some of you will be more familiar with him, what we know about Hegel, of course, I mean, aside from his work, is that he was writing, the thing I was reading in particular was the Philosophy of Right, because that's what Marx was reading, which was written kind of in an on and off way between about 1818 and 1830. All of it written in the shadow of the French Revolution and the reactions to the French Revolution that spread across Europe. And if you read the book with his context in mind, you can't help but be overcome with the sense that Hegel has that we desperately need to avoid another French Revolution. In fact, we can celebrate the changes that it wrought, and he did, as he famously toasted the French Revolution on the 14th of July every year. But we need to prevent that kind of bloodshed and chaos as he understood it again. So revolution had to have happened, but it cannot ever happen again. And so the philosophy of right is in many ways an attempt to kind of propose an order, a social order, in which revolution is unnecessary. And to me, this is exactly what the general theory does. This is Keynes. And so here I am reading this text from 110 years before the general theory itself, looking for inspiration in terms of style from Marx, and what I find in Hegel is Keynes everywhere, which for me at least was very shocking, but also really affirming that I was kind of on to something, if that makes any sense. And so just as liberalism and capitalism are kind of coming into shape in Europe in their modern shape, We have Hegel reflecting upon their emergence with Robespierre on his mind, with literally the figure of Robespierre as being the potential product of this moment. And then in 2013, so I'm in the middle of it, I'm 5 years into the book now. My family is so sick of me, they can hardly believe it. Keynes. And then in 2000, I love this photo, by the way. If I ever become famous, I want a photo like taken like this. Comes Capital in the 21st Century in 2013, 2014. And for me, at least, it's Keynes again. It's an anxiety written about, as Piketty himself says in the book, in a fear of a Ricardian apocalypse, a Marxian apocalypse. This is what he's writing against in the book, his words. And so it seems to me that Keynes is back not only as a person, and may have disappeared as a person, but as a sensibility. It's a modern thing that we need to come to grips with. But of course, now I've got Hegel, Piketty, Marx, Keynes, all in play. And I have trouble with this stuff at the best of times, but keeping everything in order started to kind of be tricky. And everything started to run together. And so we have... This is just me playing around with their various maths. That's me on the side going like, what? I don't understand. Everyone's talking. We can talk more about the math over beer if you want to. It's not very complicated math. But in the end, this is what starts to happen, is that I can't help but read all of them all the time, everywhere I look. Which, of course, is probably a problem that every author runs into when you become obsessed with what you're writing about. The thing you think about all the time, you see it everywhere. I guess that makes perfect sense. Not just authors. Everyone. It doesn't matter who you are. And so this is actually a quote from Hegel from 1821, which describes what political economy, as I understand it, is all about. It's the science of government. It's the science of the management of the relationship between rulers and ruled, which is exactly how Keynes understood it, I would argue, exactly how Piketty understands it, and exactly how I understand it in a lot of ways. Qualitative and quantitative character. You can read the quote. Sorry, I won't read it for you. I know you can all read. So to step back just for a second and think about how this project then started to unfold in my mind, because I really was having trouble keeping all the balls in the air, is that I came across this passage that the philosopher Theodor Adorno had written about Hegel. It's a fantastic book called Hegel 3 Studies, which, if you're geeky like me, you'll really enjoy. And in that book, at one point, Adorno says of Hegel that he simply cannot be understood rigorously, which for Adorno, for those of you familiar with his thinking, that's a big compliment. Because what that means is that Hegel's onto something about the real world. Because Adorno's main point in much of his work is that if we expect to have rigorous scientific knowledge of a world that is actually quite messy and awkward, then we have inadequate knowledge. If our concepts are clear and rigorous, they actually don't reflect the world at all. The world is not clear and rigorous. The world is messy and complicated. And the concepts we use to understand it need to be adequate to that world. And so when he says that Hegel can't be understood rigorously, that's like a reason to clap. And I would say that the same is very true of Keynes. And maybe the same is very true of perhaps all of us. And that's a compliment to all of us. So when we look at Keynes, and anyone who's read his work will know that underneath, always at the surface of Keynes' work, is this extraordinary confidence in the capacity of modern reason and modern technique to take us to the promised land. In fact, to take us to a place he called, in no uncertain terms, this is a quote, economic bliss. We could get there. That's what he said. And in radio addresses to the British nation all through the Depression, he would get on the radio and he would say things like, we are not too far from, the future that we all dreamed of. We can get to this place of economic bliss. And then he would say, and this is no joke either, this is a direct quote, he would say, if you leave it to me, I'll take care of it. Can you imagine? I love that. I would love to be able to say that, like to have the guts to say that, thinking it might actually be true. But beneath that extraordinary confidence, which was in many ways performative, right? He's trying to communicate to the British people that things are good precisely because his idea of economics is that it's driven by consumer confidence and investor confidence in particular. So he wants people to be confident. So he's trying to almost fool them into confidence. But beneath that is, without a doubt, in everything he wrote, a baseline of doom and gloom. Civilization itself is at a precipice. We're on the edge of a chasm, and the world is about to fall apart. Those are always right next to each other in his works. And what could take us so quickly from bliss to disaster is, in his eyes, social disorder. What he called, in some places, civil dissension. What Hegel called the rabble. It is those who have been so-called left behind, who we hear a lot about these days, who, in their rage and fury at being left behind by a social order that does not provide them with dignity or the resources to enjoy a secure and joyful life, in their anger and rage, tear apart the civilization itself that the rest of us have come to understand, the lucky ones have come to understand as being the fundamental basis of civilization. And so these are the people that Keynes is afraid of. And he always said, quoting Jane Austen, not Jane Austen, which one is it?
Balzac.
It's not Balzac, it's misery generates hate. So I can't remember who it is. It's not Balzac in this, though he might have said that, of course. He could have, maybe it was a translation. At any rate, misery generates hate, he said. And he really believed it. And he looked around at his world, and his colleagues in the Bloomsbury Circle did the same thing. And they looked at Charlotte Bronte, thank you very much. Did you look it up, or did you know it? Okay, there we go. Charlotte Bronte. Right on. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I couldn't think. Anyway, Charlotte Bronte. And so he looked around at Spain and Russia, so we have Franco in Spain and Stalin in Russia, which he understood as two sides of the same coin. We have Italy and Mussolini. We have Germany. We have this everywhere. And he sees the sort of rising fascisms and populisms as being proof of the fact that, especially the post-World War I, misery generates hate. And this dread of disorder is the theme that underlies all his work, from the early 19s to when he dies in the mid-40s. And so this is actually a passage from The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which he wrote, as many of you will know, 1920, when he left Versailles, enraged at the demands for reparations on Germany that Britain and France were putting into place. And he famously said at Versailles, if we ask this of Germany, then we will destroy their social fabric, and as he said, vengeance will not limit. Which is kind of awkward phrasing, but nonetheless, he often predicted the rise of fascist movements in Germany in the wake of the reparations demands that crushed Weimar Germany and made the place unworkable. And as he said, here, I'm going to read you the whole quote. I just put some interesting parts of it up there. He said, that's a photo of the Beer Hall Putsch, so 1923, Hitler's attempted takeover of the German state. He said, the danger confronting us, therefore, is the rapid depression of the standard of life of the European populations to a point which will mean actual starvation for some. And then he says, men will not always die quietly. For starvation, which brings to some lethargy and a helpless despair, drives other temperaments to the nervous instability of hysteria and to a mad despair. And these, in their distress, may overturn the remnants of their organization and submerge civilization itself in their attempts to satisfy desperately the overwhelming needs of the individual. This is the danger against which all of our resources and courage and idealism must now cooperate. And so his conclusion, looking at this, and again, I would argue that this is the conclusion he makes throughout all his life, his work, is that a situation of overwhelming needs is the highest priority. Principle, all the rest of it, economic theories, they must be thrown out the window. Pragmatism and an attempt to think about meeting those needs, addressing necessity, is in the absolute essential interests of civilization itself, as he understands civilization, which of course is not straightforward. And to ignore it in the interests of, for example, laissez-faire thinking or free market thinking, the kind of dominant economic mode of his moment, was both stupid and dangerous. And this actually is the origin of the famous quote from which the title of the book is drawn, "In the long run, we are all dead." And it's from 1924, from a work actually about the gold standard, a tract on monetary reform, where Keynes was arguing against the return of the gold standard after the First World War. And he makes this point about the economic theory that the gold standard provides a sound money basis in the long run. And he says, but this long run is a misleading guide to current affairs. In the long run, we are all dead. Hence the title of my book. And actually, a murder mystery with two economists called In the Long Run, We Are All Dead. I I just discovered. Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task if in tempestuous seasons they can only tell us that when the storm is long past, the ocean is flat again. Now, you can see that when Keynes wanted, he was quite a good writer, I think. And this was a crucial intervention at the time, even though it didn't win the day. And the gold standard was returned to, and Keynes, as a critique of that, wrote The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill for the return of the gold standard. But nonetheless, it was never meant to be confined just to the realm of monetary policy, I would argue. It's just an early statement of what I would argue is a Keynesian worldview, one that is still dominant today for many of us. It's an existential anxiety, I would argue. In the long run, we are all dead. So in the short run, we have to do something, or in the long run, we will all be dead. And 15 years later, this is still running through his thinking. So this is from a reflection after the general theory has been published, and he's fearing the upcoming Second World War, which at that point many are anticipating. And you can see very clearly the actual sense of what he was trying to say. It is our duty to prolong peace hour by hour, day by day, for as long as we can. Note the desperation. This is no longer like we'll get there to economic bliss. This is like, let's just hope we make it tomorrow. We do not know what the future will bring, except that it will be quite different from anything we could predict. I have said in another context that it is a disadvantage of the long run, that in the long run we are all dead. But I could have said equally well that it is a great advantage of the short run, that in the short run we are still alive. Life and history are made up of short runs. If we are at peace in the short run, sorry, it's been cut off, but at the end it says, oh, I've cut off on my notes too. If we are peace, basically, the quote ends with something to the effect of, if we are at peace in the long run, that is worth something. Let's hope that something will come along. That's all he's hoping for. We put off disaster long enough, in fact, we'll put off disaster long enough that something better might come along. That's all he's hoping for. So this is married with economic bliss, and, I promise to you that my grandchildren will be wealthier than anyone ever was, and all the rest of it. So it's a fascinating moment, but it's a moment that lasts his entire life. And Hegel, actually, funnily enough, said very similar things, reflecting on the legacy of the French Revolution. And I just fell upon these by accident, actually. I can't read German, but these were translated from his lectures. And he said in 1820, the plague ends too, he said. It supposedly rights itself, but hundreds of thousands have perished of it. They're all dead. Everything, therefore, has supposedly been straightened out again. It's an exactly similar, or I would argue, similar perspective. And then he went on to say, after that phrase, no one should trust a principle according to which things will adjust, things will take care of themselves. And that's the Keynesian insight, is that when we think of the modern moment, liberalism and capitalism coming together to produce what we might understand as the dominant modernity of our moment, there's nothing natural in that system that will overcome its logical, material, and ideological conflicts that are nonetheless always produced by the celebration of an individual interest that is entirely unmoored from collective welfare. As long as that's the case, we're not going to get some free market utopian dream. We'll actually get the opposite. What Hegel called the corruption of civil society, or Keynes called poverty in the midst of plenty, or all these forces that produce the left behind, the rabble, the people who will undo civilization itself. Things will not take care of themselves, not the laws of nature, not the wisdom of the demos. None of this is going to get us out of where we're headed. If we don't manage the short runs of life, necessity, and history, then we're doomed. And this is exactly what we'll get. Trump, we'll get Le Pen, we'll get Kelly Leach, hopefully not, and then we'll get worse. This is precisely what he's saying. He's looking at Mussolini and Hitler, and this is what he's saying. And this, I would argue, is the fundamental Keynesian proposition. And extending that, I would say that it's actually an essential component of political life in modern liberal capitalism. Since long before Keynes and since long after his death. And that's why Keynesianism, as I frame it in the book at least, I think still matters so much. Because it's a widespread anxiety, widely shared, I would argue, across political commitments that don't often gather together under one umbrella. And the other thing I would add, as I'm coming to the end of this, having made it through half my notes. The Keynesian critique, in this sense, is a distinctly post-revolutionary critique. And by that I mean not that revolution or social transformation of a radical type is no longer possible, but only that this kind of thinking is only possible with a revolution to haunt it, with a Robespierre to haunt its memory, and to make it afraid, to build in that anxiety. And it's that distinctly post-revolutionary perspective that I think is what defines the modernity of this kind of perspective, the specter of disorder, violence, revolution. And in that sense, I would say even the most austere variety of liberalism that's in place right now is nonetheless always backed by a Keynesian panic button. I think we can see this actually unfolding in Europe right now. And even that most austere liberalism depends nonetheless on this Keynesian trapdoor through which to escape. It's like a safety valve for modern liberalism. In that sense, it's a sort of reluctantly radical critique of liberalism, because it's the liberalism that emerges when everything seems to hang in the balance and we're told something must be done. We're not even sure what it is. We just know something. And Keynesianism is the something. Because it's ultimately civilization itself that's at stake. And Keynes himself was very clear about this. It wasn't just capitalism or profitability or business confidence that was at stake. It was civilization. So this is another quote of his. Civilization is a thin and precarious crust erected by the personality and will of a very few, in which he would include himself, and only maintained by rules and conventions skillfully put across and guilefully preserved. We have to basically fool the masses into civilization, to trick them into civilization. This is the perspective that I think is nonetheless very common across many political views today, in a moment in which we feel like change is out of control. So populism itself seems to me to be a code word for radical political activity that is out of control, that the elites, whether they be progressives or conservatives, feel is beyond their own management. And that sense, I think, is very widespread and really worth thinking about. In this moment of a sort of calamitous past and a really intimidating future at this moment. So, I'm quite proud of this slide, I have to say. That's Robespierre on the left, Maximilien Robespierre. And he was, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure everyone does, the leader of the Jacobins during the French Revolution. And he once stood up before the convention, the democratic gathering, assembly that was put in place after the king was at least not formally in power anymore. In 1792, and he was so enraged at the bourgeoisie that made up most of the convention, who were now kind of backing off on a lot of the revolutionary promises because most of the revolutionary work that they had hoped for had already been done. The king was gone. There was a lot more commercial freedom, all sort of stuff. So now let's stop the revolution now. Let's slow it down. And the people are in the streets. And Robespierre, who, as far as I can tell, only said everything in a rage. But I think he was just permanently enraged. You know that there's a novel by the Prayer for Owen Meany. And everything Owen Meany says is in capital letters in the book. I feel like that's what Robespierre must have been like. I should have put it in capital letters here. But he stood up in front of the convention and he said, "Do you want a revolution without revolution?" And to summarize what I'm trying to say, Keynesians are the people who would say, actually, yeah, that sounds like a pretty good idea. Yeah, I'd like a revolution without revolution. Oui, bien sûr. And I think that I guess what I'm trying to say is that the book is an attempt to confront in myself, but not obviously just in myself, to confront in a modern sensibility this feeling that the tragedy of modernity, in other words, the fact that it seems to continually produce poverty and inequality and indignity and insecurity, is a tragedy with which we must learn to live and manage. To such an extent that I would argue that the main goal of political economy as a science of government today is an attempt to legitimate poverty to the extent that the poor are willing to live with their poverty, so that civilization itself can persist. And to the extent that we accept that tragedy as being true, we have embraced what I would argue is the Keynesian frame. And our need to get beyond it is is driven by my hope that we can recognize the failures of our capacity to thus far address those problems of indignity and insecurity and poverty, but while refusing the idea that this is a tragic inevitability with which we must learn to live. I completely refuse that position. And so much of the book at the end hinges on this conception of what I would argue is a radical kernel at the heart of what seems like a kind of staid Keynesianism. The idea that poverty is produced by the system itself. That, I think, is a really radical perspective that many Keynesians, of course, have not wanted to look at. And perhaps I include myself in that in ways I have never understood. But I think we need to embrace that, because in doing so, we can see a world in which the revolutionary politics, which assumes people have nothing to lose, loses some of its purchase. I would actually argue that most people have a lot to lose, or at least understand themselves as having a lot to lose. And insofar as that's true, revolutionary politics, radical politics, can sometimes seem to pass them by, because it's like the world that we have is not worth keeping. But I think most people actually think that much of it is. And insofar as we can grasp a radical heart at the heart of Keynesianism, we have the opportunity to radicalize that perspective, that most people in a new world would like to see significant parts of it from the old. It's not a inversion, it's a renovation. And that's a politics, I think, that can reach people much more closely than perhaps some of the stuff to which I have long adhered in my life. I'm not even sure anymore. But the book itself is an attempt to kind of think hard about what I understand civilization to be, and what I understand a new one might look like, and how those two relate in a politics that is not dismissive of people's daily concerns or their attachments to what little dignity, security, and wealth the existing system provides them. Thanks very much.